I'm in. Oh, turn off your sound. Yeah. Turn it off. Yeah. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Gabby.
Hi. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, can hear you.
I can hear you very well.
Great. Why don't we wait maybe 30 more seconds for people who are coming in a little bit late to begin, and then we'll get started. So why don't we begin? I just want to say thank you all so much for coming. I know that this event is coming together kind of at the last minute, but obviously with everything that's going on in the world, last minute seems to be our new speed for everything. So I just wanted to say once again, thank you for taking the time during finals to come to this event, meeting the movement and the moment, police and prison abolition in the United States. We're joined by an incredibly dynamic and impressive group of speakers today. We'll be hearing from Dr. Avery Willis Hoffman, who is the program director at the Park Avenue Armory in New York and a leading member of the exhibition content and design team for the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Avery earned her PhD and master's in classical languages and literature from Balliol at Oxford, where she was a Marshall Scholar, and earned her bachelor's in classics and English at Stanford University. We'll also be hearing from Dr. Charles Robert Davidson, who is the director of the Pre-Law Institute and Center for Postgraduate Opportunities at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. Dr. Davidson holds a bachelor's in French, a master's in law and diplomacy, a JD, and a PhD in international relations. And lastly, but not least, we will be hearing from Chelsea Jackson, who is an abolitionist, an activist, and a current Rhodes Scholar, who is still living in Oxford, and her most recent paper is entitled Abolition and Racial Democracy, A Genealogy of Black Radical Thought from Douglass to Davis. Thank you all so much for coming to speak to our Somerville MCR today. I myself am obviously somebody who's engaged in activism and who's an academic, but I've really been shaken personally by the events in the United States over the past few weeks. The police killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and recently Rayshard Brooks have not only inspired me to recommit myself to action and to being committed to Black liberation and social justice generally, but I've been incredibly amazed and hopeful to see that so many thousands of people in the United States and around the world are also recommitting themselves in solidarity to fight for Black lives and to prove that we matter. And I just wanted to ask the question to the panel to open up this discussion. What do these protests mean to you? What does this moment mean to you? Charles, would you like to start?
Well, I'll start. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And thank you, Gabby, for inviting me. In response to the question of what these protests mean to me, on a personal level, I have to say that I was born 2 years before the rebellions of 67, 68. And here we are 52 years later, 54 years later about, the other bookend of my life, seeing the same sort of events occur. So for me, I have to say that I am very guardedly optimistic about this moment. As a lawyer and someone who studies, of course, social justice, and from a legal perspective, I have to say that I have some guarded optimism. I am less optimistic just because as a Black person, I know America. And I know the American people, and I don't say that in some sort of overly general sense, but I just understand the track record we have of follow through on these issues. I think perhaps I am a bit bitter about these things. We saw the same type of excitement around the Civil Rights Act, around voting rights. We saw all of these things. Who would imagine that 50 some years later, we would still be talking about police officers killing Black people in this way, right? Who would think that we were talking about Black people living in the conditions that we do in this way? I have to say, I love to see the protests on the street. I believe in the power of the people, but I also understand that support for these things is ephemeral, and I understand that law and legislation can only do so much. So for me, it's a bit of a mixed bag, I'd have to say.
And I'll jump in. Hopefully you can all hear me. Thank you so much, Gabby, for convening us, and to all of you. It's so great to see an incredible group here, and thank you so much for the invitation. I was thinking fondly of my Oxford days, and then it's funny, I had a moment where I thought about, I was in Oxford starting in the year 2000, and that's literally right. I watched 9/11 live in the MCR at Balliol College with my American friends, and lived in Oxford during a time where George Bush was president, and we were entering wars, which are still going on, and we still feel the repercussions of it. And it's really extraordinary to think about the last 20 years since I was a graduate student in Oxford, and what it meant to be living abroad and living outside of my home. I weirdly had just been in the US, for a spell, and had returned, I think on something like 9/9 or something like that. And so I just had a moment of reflection about, what it means to be an American living abroad. And I also felt so strongly at the time that I had a really clearer perspective than being in the middle of it all. And so I don't know how you all feel about that, but I think being in New York now and being in the middle of it all, it's been, and I think as Charles said, a sort of like reverberation of so many things. And I think one of the things that I've been talking to friends and colleagues about is how complex this is, right? Like we're in a moment, but there's a historical context for why we are in this moment. There's a reason why it was messy in the civil rights era, and it's still messy now because of the way America was founded and what America was founded on, those principles. It was founded in an era of slavery and in an era of racial subjugation. And it's just going to take a really long time to unravel all of that and to work towards equality, which we are all in our own way doing. And I think that's the second thing for me personally. I'm in the arts. I'm in arts and culture. I'm very, very deeply embedded with artists and with art administrators and institutions, some of which are struggling quite a bit and are finally being taken to task about how they support Black artists, artists of color, the power of art to reveal some of these bigger issues. So there's, I think for me personally, a deep layering of the issues. The protests have very strong themes, but it's also for me about what it means for me to get to work each day, to travel from my home to my work, and what I go through each day and how people treat me based on what I look like. And I'm a curator, a producer, someone who's, out in the world. And, that level of racism, I think, comes on so many different levels. And so for me, I'm 100%, supporting my friends who are out there. I live a little bit outside of the city, and obviously we've been in quarantine, so I haven't been in the city, but I've been supporting as much as I can, and just in deep solidarity, like the true meaning of that word, with everyone who's out there. But I think just to say there's so many ways to support the movement. There's so many ways, even if it's just within your own immediate family. We all know what it's like to be at the table if there are differing opinions about things. So just to say there's lots of different ways to support, and I think just to start unpacking the many layers and complexities of this issue, and it will take time, and that each time we're moving forward. And so, like Charles, I have guarded optimism, but optimism is there, and I'm not sure that optimism was there before, to be honest, even 20 years ago, let alone 50. So yeah, that's sort of my initial feeling as we're in the middle of it all.
And Chelsea, I think what's so interesting to me, and something that both Avery and Charles are discussing, is how these protests are building on the legacy of not only American white supremacy and of slavery, but also of the modern carceral state. And so my question to you as an abolitionist is, what does abolition mean to you in that historical context? And is abolition meaningfully different from defunding the police?
Hi, thank you everyone, and thank you for being patient with my technical difficulties. Despite being a millennial, me and technology do not get along. To speak on abolition, so for me personally, abolition is first and foremost the politics of my ancestors. And so when I identify myself as an abolitionist, I walk in the footsteps of Frederick Douglass, and a former slave who became an abolitionist and toured the world, Europe, and the United States, advocated politically using rhetoric, organized abolitionist groups, both Black and interracial. I'm walking in the footsteps of Ida B. Wells, who drafted the first lynching bill that Kamala Harris and Cory Booker have just gotten past the Senate. And she was writing those bills in 1909, right? And writing the Red Record. And so for me, abolition is a dream of freedom. The same dream that I imagine that my great grandmother Viola dreamed on the cotton plantation. And I can't imagine that in her conception of freedom, that there were buildings filled with cages. I can't imagine that in her conception of freedom, that there were people in uniform driving around with the ability to kill you, to stop you, to investigate you, to question you. She would have seen those people as slave patrollers. And so she would have, and so abolition to me it's a way of viewing the world. It's an ideology, it's a practice, but it's also a belief system that says, in order for human beings to live in dignity and with freedom and with respect, that our human society requires a remaking of new institutions, new social arrangements, new political organization, and economic transformation that's based on community needs and community scars from the past. And so in this moment, how can we conceptualize slavery being connected to policing, being connected to prisons? And therefore that my ancestors who were slavery abolitionists would have been prison abolitionists, would have been police abolitionists. And the way we make this connection, Avery and Charles began to touch on it, but it's the direct outgrowth. So America begins as colonies of Britain. These colonies are slave colonies. In these colonies by the 18th century, you have Black enslaved people, Africans, outnumbering the white colonists. And so the only way that they can prevent the bloody slave rebellions that are taking over the West Indies and eventually award Haiti its freedom and independence in 1804 is to establish slave patrols, is to establish armed guards, is to establish corporal punishments that are backed up by the state institutions, the state government, the courthouse, the post office, the everyone in the community. And so because these slave patrols emerged to control slaves, and then immediately after slavery, they morph into these militia type police forces and also into the Ku Klux Klan, that the use of vigilante violence and state approved violence to control a majority of people who are dispossessed of the fruits of their labor, who are repressed and not allowed to express their political power or have any sense of economic independence or control over their lives and their families. You need an armed guard to keep those people from revolting. And so that's the connection between abolition of slavery and abolition of policing. And so when we get to your question about what's the difference between defunding the police and abolition, for me, defunding the police is a step towards abolition. And I say that carefully because depending on how it's done and in the spirit in which it's done, but the demand that's coming from the streets that we're hearing in the streets of Paris, in the streets of Berlin, in the streets of Rio de Janeiro, but also in Chicago and Atlanta and Tallahassee and Chattanooga and New York and LA, is a call for an end to an occupying force in poor communities, in communities of color, in indigenous communities. And it's saying no more occupying, no more murdering, no more harassing, no more stalking, no more disrupting our lives and our children's lives. And so it's very important that I want to honor, lastly, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is an abolitionist, who gives us the great concept of a non-reformist reform, which is a reform of the criminal justice system today that changes people's lives who are impacted by it today and makes them better. But in the long run, doesn't give the criminal justice system more money, more resources, or more power. And so defunding the police is one of those non-reformist reforms that walks us towards the vision of abolition.
That's beautiful, Chelsea. When you're speaking, I'm reminded so much of this quote from Angela Davis, who is a famed political activist and professor in the United States. She remarked that prisons don't disappear social problems. They disappear human beings. Homelessness, unemployment, drug addiction, mental illness, and illiteracy are only a few of the problems that disappear from public view when the human beings contending with them are relegated to cages. And in that vein, Charles, I want to ask, as a lawyer and also as an educator, how do you integrate these concepts of fundamental Black liberation, of prison abolition, in a school like John Jay, that has numerous Black students, but who also aspire to working in law enforcement or in government?
Right. That's a great question, Gabby. It's a challenge that we walk very, very finely every day. Just as by way of background, as Gabby pointed out, I teach at a college that is a college of criminal justice. A lot of our students enter the college with the idea that they are going to work in law enforcement. At the same time, the college also has a very, very strong ethos of social justice, right? So our motto is creating fierce advocates for social justice. So there's this inherent tension in all of our classrooms, I think, and in all of our spaces, because our students very often come in thinking about law enforcement or government work. And then, of course, we are often thinking, many professors at least, not everyone, but we are often thinking about how to inculcate the notions of liberation and the notions of social justice, the notions that go beyond basic reform. I think Chelsea's point about the sort of the limited and damaging nature of sort of reformist ideas can sometimes be lost, right? And I think it's something that we try in the classroom to navigate. Obviously, one of the things that, and I can only speak for myself, there are various professors do various things. One of the things that I feel is that, and we had a pre-conversation before we came to this whole group, and one of the I had asked how freely can I speak, and I was told that I could speak very freely, and I think I will. One of the things that I have done over the course of my teaching career has been that I have made working directly with and speaking directly to Black students and then students of color, specifically in my classrooms, and to really speak to them, because many of our students have come through the American educational system, and in particular, the New York City public school education system, that has intentionally left out any conversations around the notion of liberation. Really, it's left out in without putting too fine a point on it, it's left out anything about history, about Blackness, about who we are, about what America is, about the nature of our institutions. So for me as an educator, I think I have a responsibility, and I think Avery made a great point about how we all have to come at this from our particular angle. And I come at this with the angle that my responsibility in the classroom is to infuse everything I do with this idea that liberation is possible. But you have to understand, of course, the historical context of these things. It's really amazing to me every semester, and it's no fault of my students, but it is amazing how little they know. I think the names that Chelsea raised, Ida B. Wells, I think even the name Frederick Douglass would have only loose connotations in their minds. I think very few of my students would be able to speak about who these people were. And again, it's not a fault of the students, but I do ask them to interrogate why these names are unfamiliar to them, and to understand that someone made a policy choice that people like them don't need to know things like that. And that everything that we don't know serves to benefit someone else, right? Our ignorance, and I say that word in the best sense, benefits someone else. And so what I think we do in classrooms is help students understand, of course, what they don't know, but to interrogate really why they don't know. Why is it that you're reaching the age of 21, 22, and the idea of Black liberation, you've never heard about it? Well, it's interesting because I went to Alabama with a bunch of students in January. We took 33 students to Alabama, and these are students from our honors program. Quite a lot of them had never heard of Selma before. Quite a lot of them, we went to Selma, and then we had to sort of explain the meaning of Selma, right? The notion of America's history with lynching was something that had been obscured. And so, I had a conversation with the students one evening, and I asked them, well, what does it feel like to realize that you never heard of any of these things? And what has that done to you as a person who operates in this society? And the students routinely told me that they were really dismayed and really disheartened to realize that for them Black history in New York City public schools quite often is two segments, one on Martin Luther King and one on Malcolm X. Many students said they didn't even have that. So, for me at John Jay, I think my work is, and I'm wrapping this up, but my work is to both expose students to things, because I realize how far, how little knowledge they've gained through their formal education. And again, it's not a fault of theirs. I lie the blame squarely at the feet of these institutions, who of course are perpetuating this, and there are obvious reasons why they aren't teaching Black history. There are obvious reasons why students why students are slow to engage in these conversations, just because they don't have any historical foundation. There's no reference for them. So our work, I think, is to sort of provide foundations, but then also to move them past that and to get to what I think Chelsea called the dream, right? I mean, the foundation is crucial, but then we don't want to stay there, right? We want to take this to the place of helping them dream. And I think that's what I'm trying to do, and what I think a lot of people are trying to do at John Jay. Does that response to your question, Gabby? I think that was there were a lot of things there, but I hope that sort of it was responsive.
Absolutely. Do any of the other panelists want to respond? Or can I move on to Another question.
Yeah, I'll chime in, Gabby. Thanks, Charles. I think, and Chelsea as well. I think one of the things that I learned sort of the hard way working on the Smithsonian project, I don't know how many of you had a chance to go to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a deliberately long name, but we called it NAMAC for short, so I'll use NAMAC. So, one of the things that we learned, and the first thing I learned is that it took 100 years for Congress to pass whatever they call it. It wasn't a bill, but some kind of proclamation that the museum could exist. And so that to me was really quite telling as we started on this road. And there had been many folks, including Lonnie Bunch, who is now the head of the Smithsonian, who had been working for many years before I joined the team. But my role on that project was to essentially manage the content that would be displayed in all the exhibits in all of the galleries, which, as you can imagine, 400 years of American history, good luck. Where do you start? What stories do you tell? Who do you bring forward? What kind of objects do you bring forward in a sort of museum context? So I wanted to talk just for a second about that, because I think as people ask me right now, like over and over, like, what can I do? I sort of say, go to the museum, open your books, and really, as Chelsea was outlining, I think there are places that people, I mean, obviously not right now during COVID, but when we're allowed out of our homes, there are places that people can go to learn this history. And the effort that it took over a century to make that museum in particular come alive is a testament to the struggle, but it's also a repository of so many stories and moments. And our goal in making that museum, like our sort of model, was like the Louvre and the British Museum, places that are so incredibly dense that you cannot just whiz around in a couple hours and then leave and say you're educated, right? So, we wanted to build a deeply layered experience. We wanted people to keep coming back, and we wanted people to focus in on this very, very complex history. So if you go to the museum, you go down, if you want to, you start in the deep bowels of the earth at the beginning of this story, which isn't even the beginning. But as you start, if you follow the sort of main themes, you start to have an understanding of how we got to where we are today. And I think that is so important. I think, Charles, you're so right. When you think about the education system, and even those of us who went to private school, we still never got this history. We still never got even, the just a layer of the incredible sacrifice that our ancestors have made to get us to where we are today. Unless you do go to graduate school and you focus in on this topic, the average student of any, discipline is not going to get this sort of depth. And so one of the things that we really wanted to do at that museum was to make sure that it was about liberation, that there was a thread that you could follow about Black joy, about the struggle for liberation, that you could follow a thread about amazing objects that people kept on their person as they were running to freedom. The sort of minutia of daily life that was joyful and amazing. The creation of American culture that came out of this very, very challenging circumstance. And so I think when you look at culture and you look at the consumption of American culture abroad, there's so many things that, of course, we wanted to do everything. But I think that my point being that there's something about the power of history to ground you and to educate you. And so as people ask me, what can I do? I think there is something about self-education right now. And as people are quarantined and have time to read, unless you have little kids like me, where it's just like impossible. But, I think there's something about taking this moment, no matter where you come from, to just do a little bit of that reading, because then you'll understand a little better your friend, your colleague, your family member, and what they're struggling with, because the struggle is in the DNA of the people on all sides, right? It's not just from the sort of Black perspective. So I just wanted to sort of add that to what Charles said. And I think that we will all be in better places as we get more informed and more educated. The one thing too that I recommend, for example, is there's a film there called The History of Violence. And that film was really painful to work on and to make, and to sort of figure out what that thread of violence is across our history. And as you read the wall labels and watch this film, you start to realize that thread of violence is really why we are where we are today. On the police side of things, as Chelsea was talking about slave patrols, that use of violence, it was very deliberate and it's been consistent and it still exists. And as you see how violence mutates over the course of American history, you have a lot of aha moments. They're kind of terrifying, but you have a lot of aha moments. And I think it also speaks to how protesters and quote rioters are being portrayed today. It's all within this context. So I'll leave it there, but I just wanted to add that to what Charles said.
Absolutely. In thinking about narrative, one of the themes I think that's connecting all three of your excellent points is narrative. Media narrative, historical narrative, educational narratives, institutional narratives about what is or is not important and worthy of studying. My question has to do with the perception of police in America. I think that people hear the idea of abolish the police or abolish prisons, and they freak out because their concept of the police is law and order. It's like Elliot Stabler and like some telegenic cop who's fighting crime. And it's not, it is absolutely not George Floyd. It is absolutely not Breonna Taylor. And so in thinking about how do we not only change the narrative around what policing is to be more representative of reality and of the Black experience, but also how do we use media and narrative to fundamentally separate the idea of policing from public safety or law enforcement from public safety?
Oh, I was on mute. Okay, thank you. And thank you to Avery and Charles for those amazing points. On this question, I think two things we have to understand. The first one is that what we radicals like to call propaganda, with the things that you've talked about as far as the sting shows where they're saving children from sex predators, or they're responding to sexual violence, or they're breaking up a domestic dispute, or they're stopping a gangbanger from murdering somebody, or they're saving the little baby who's gotten kidnapped. In reality, over 95% of what police do has nothing to do with serious crime. The vast majority of what they do is respond to traffic citations, respond to people calling, issue tickets, and chase up warrants of people who had something else that they had done, and looking around for those people and running people's license plate and harassing Black people as they live their lives, right? So the first part is recognizing that propaganda is very purposeful. And it started after the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And so we have to understand that the first cop shows come out in the 1970s. And this is right off of the very successful media tactic that primarily nonviolent with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Dr. Martin Luther King used, which was, we're going to be peaceful and nonviolent. We're going to dress in our best clothes, and we're going to show you how cruel and brutal these Southern racists are in real time on televisions. And this is when television sets are first proliferating across the United States. So in the 1960s and 50s and 60s, you have this very successful media strategy, which effectively creates the moral, right, the entire moral dilemma that we all actually believe the civil rights movement was based upon. It wasn't based on that at all. It's based on politics, but let's go with that. That morality begins to be dissolved and purposefully chipped away at in the 1970s, both with fictional cop shows and also a media turn to police as the saviors of communities that are overridden by violence and crime, i.e., Black, brown, dark, poor, etc. And the recognizing that these two threads work together, and that over the same period that we've changed our position on police, because in reality, Black people prior to integration, prior to the civil rights movement, understood that police were not there for their safety, and that police would kill you, police were members of the Klan, etc. Right? So that was known. So then you have this transition to the propaganda and everything to, on a national scale, address all these negative images on police. And then in Black communities, some coming from Black communities themselves, such as in Atlanta, they are trying to reform policing. And they're suggesting as early as 1920 in Atlanta, we need more Black police officers, because Black police officers would be able to tell the difference between a good, upstanding community member and a criminal, and therefore good, upstanding community members wouldn't be harassed by the police. And only criminals would be harassed by the police, and therefore it would stop crime and it will work. Black communities as early as 1940s and the 1950s. In 1965, Somerville Riot in Atlanta, Georgia, after the Atlanta Police Department kills a Black man, they demand community review boards for the police with the power to fire problematic officers. And so it goes back to what Avery and Charles were both saying about education. The other concern about but what about cops keep us safe, and but what about this? It shows not only a misunderstanding or ignorance of American history, but also of the fact that it's never been successful. So in 1965, when Atlanta police kill a Black man in Summerhill, there's a Summerhill riot. The Atlanta chapter of SNCC almost leaves SNCC because they decide we can't continue to be nonviolent while poor Black people are being assailed in their community. And they're demanding community review boards, they're demanding more Black police officers, they're demanding that officers can't carry billy clubs, here Taser today. They're demanding that that problematic officers be sent out with a sergeant to observe their behavior, here body cam today. They're demanding that certain officers aren't given guns, or that only senior officers have guns or the right to deploy their guns, here excessive force policies today, right? So the reality is, this is not an accident that we don't know that in 1965, Black people were asking cops, stop killing us, we matter. It's not an accident that today the signs read Black Lives Matter, and in 1960 they read I am a man. And in 1830, David Walker's appeal to the colored peoples of the world, he's a free Black man living in Boston who was assassinated the year after he writes this. But David Walker in 1830 says, am I not a man and a brother? The Africans of the world, are we not human beings? Are we not owed respect and dignity? So I say all this to say that the idea behind reform for many people stems from a misunderstanding. Because if you think something is generally good and has a few issues with it, you would respond with reform. But when you know the history of the institution, how it started, how it's continued, how it's worked over and over again and slipped and slid its way to avoid from stopping its behaviors of violence, then you click into the reality that, okay, this is just going to keep morphing and keep changing. And we're going to be demanding in 2065 what our ancestors were demanding in 1965 and 1865. But we've got to go beyond that. So I don't want to keep talking. I want to see if other folks want to jump in. But yeah, we've got to clue ourselves in. We've got to wake up.
Avery or Charles, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thank you, Chelsea. Yeah, there's so much to think about, and it's hard to talk in a way after that because part of what it is for me is like, yeah, where do you begin, and what does that abolition really look like? I mean, especially when you think about so many different parts of America and how so for example, the police, so I live in a small town north of Harlem, an hour north of Harlem. Um, and I've lived here for a year, a little bit over a year, and our first Halloween, we walked with our kids in our neighborhood, and the sheriff was on our street handing out candy, and everyone went and said hello, and he introduced himself to us and said, if you ever need anything, and we're a mixed race family, and said, if you need anything, here's my card, just very friendly, very welcoming. It was a neighborhood block Halloween party. It was literally let's just say I've never experienced that kind of welcome from a sheriff before. And coming from Brooklyn, we lived in Brooklyn previously. And, over the course of the past year, we've run into the sheriff at the supermarket, various places. He's always very cordial, says hello. And our community is very small. It's a lot of commuters to New York City and a lot of professionals. It's fairly mixed. And I look at him now, and it just makes me wonder, and just to add that in our school system, we have, I think they're called deputy sheriffs, I guess, who are in the schools. So my son is in first grade, and there's the sheriff who greets you, a deputy who greets you in the morning when the kids come in. He is armed, which, that's a whole other topic, a whole other Zoom to talk about the presence of police. But again, it just makes me wonder about a lot of things that I don't even feel I can talk about or articulate right now. Chelsea, following your thoughts, it's like, what happens in that situation if that person is removed?
But where you have the power, Avery, is right in your community. Mm-hmm. So the slave patrol started with just 4 plantation owners getting together and saying, we need, right?
Yeah.
It didn't get up to Congress until, you see what I'm saying? All these groups were already doing it, and then it became formalized. So I think the first step is you could even go around to all the parents at your child's school and say, do you really think we need a sheriff's deputy with a gun at our children's school? Do you really think that's what we need? And if you don't, would you sign this petition? Because getting a police officer who's armed out of the environment where children are trying to learn is abolitionist. And that's something anyone can do wherever they live. And it doesn't require you to call your congressman 50 times or go wait in line to vote. It's just talking to the person at the pickup line.
Right. Well, and I think to your point, Chelsea, I think people need to really understand what this call to defund the police really means, right? And maybe you can say a little bit more about that, because I think people are also very much misunderstanding that. And I totally understand it as a step to abolition. But that's a perfect example, right? Like, why is this deputy sheriff's job, full-time job, to be in my son's elementary school? And again, I'm just bringing up my community because it's not in Brooklyn. It's not in the middle of New York City. It has different issues. It has other situations. So I think Gabby, forgive me for asking Chelsea to say a little bit more about the defund the police, because I think that's a very misunderstood, what I'm witnessing is that people are misunderstanding what that means.
Can I respond? Okay.
Absolutely.
This is exciting. I love this question. Okay, so first we need a baseline. In 2019, let's just take New York. The New York Police Department received over $19 million in funding. Now, the New York Police Department got more money than homeless programs, education programs, healthcare programs, housing programs, and food programs combined. What does this tell me? That when someone's homeless in New York, there's not an office you can call to get that person a house, but you can call NYPD. When someone's hungry in New York and going through a trash can, you can't send them to a food bank, but you can call the NYPD. When you see a child or a group of teenagers that are out and about, there's not a youth center that you can tell them, hey, why don't y'all go play basketball down there? But you can call the NYPD, right? So what this does is it begins to make all of us in our community, everyone from the teacher to the social worker, to the shop owner, to just the person walking down the street, complicit in making our society a police state. Because when the police department is the part of your government, or your federal government, Pentagon, Department of Defense, when your police department is where you put most of your money, you're showing the people that what you care about is not preventing harm. Because law enforcement comes in after it's already happened. I've come here to punish you for what you've already done. I'm not here to prevent it from happening. And so when we see all the money in New York City being sucked into the NYPD, and we see them being in full, armed guard with the riot shields and the face masks and the batons and the tasers, and we just saw nurses wearing trash bags for PPE and re-wearing N95 masks. So on a really basic level, my favorite thing about getting demands from the streets is that they are simple and they mean what they say. Defund. They get too much money. They have too many things. Teachers are buying their own chalk. Okay? Teachers are buying books and pencils for their students. We have lunch ladies who are investing and trying to pay off people's children's lunch debt. But we have police departments across the country that are equipped with military equipment from the Pentagon under the 1033 program. So what the call to defund police first and foremost says, stop giving money to the people with guns and start giving that money to the people who can provide something for the community. Because the police don't do anything positive. And I say that statement very specifically because even Avery's example of her positive encounter with that sheriff's deputy, that was a Halloween block party. That didn't have anything to do with his job. That wasn't his job. That was something he was doing, right, in addition to. Even the idea of community policing as a reform, which was heavily pushed under the Obama administration. What it does is keep giving cops all the same money and all the same incentives to do everything they're already doing, and then gives them more money to come to your Halloween block party to convince you that they're good for your community. And so defunding says, we want to take away as much capacity and money from these armed security guards and give it to the other aspects of our government that actually serve the people. Now, does this mean that every city and municipality is going to drop their police budget to zero? No, we know how politics works, right? But if the demand is zero and we get the budget cut in half, right? That's half the officers. That's half the tear gas being deployed. That's half the homeless folks being harassed and their sleeping bags being sprayed with pepper spray, right? And the other part of defund the police is recognizing that the problems that police have been deployed to solve are still there. The police rode through my neighborhood trying to deter people from breaking the law, and People still sold drugs in the neighborhood. People still had guns in the neighborhood. They just avoided the police. And so they're not solving any problems. So why do we keep pumping more money into something that's not working and in fact is harming, hurting, destroying, pulling apart? And the last part of defund the police that I really want to emphasize is that communities are also saying that we know what we need. And we don't need an occupying force with guns and tasers that has been trained to be deathly afraid of us, that has been trained and taught that we want to kill them because they're police officers. We don't want those people in our communities with the power of life and death. And so, and that's the demand, that's the call, and it comes straight from the streets, not from textbooks and academics.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. This was so informative and such an interesting and probative conversation. I'm just wondering, in our last few minutes, if anybody has any questions that they would like to pose to the panel, that you can type into the chat and then we can refer over. Hi, Kaylin, do you have a question?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you all so much for being on this panel and for your discussion. It was incredibly eye-opening as somebody that studies African-American history. I love the talk of history and bringing it to relevance with our current political and social climate. So thank you all for making those connections for us. I actually had a question for Chelsea in particular. So as someone, as a historian, as a scholar, I was wondering if you could kind of point, perhaps you can provide it later, or you have any kind of recommendations for resources, for books, for those kinds of resources for people to educate themselves, because as you all mentioned earlier in the discussion, that education is so important, especially self-education. And so I was wondering if you just had any recommendations in particular that off the top of your head that you might be willing to share with us.
Yeah, just quickly, Are Prisons Necessary by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. That's in the New York Times, if you just Google that. Abolition Democracy by Angela Davis. I'd also recommend the Abolition Toolkit from Critical Resistance. And then finally, if you're interested in reading something from actually a police officer's perspective, there's a article on Medium called Confessions of a Former Bastard Cop. That's really the name, I'm not making it up. And that's on Medium. So if you read that, that's about a 20-minute read. That's really good.
We have one more question directed at Charles. And the question is, what do you feel the law and lawyers have to offer in the space of abolition and defunding?
Oh, okay, yes. So let me just start off by saying that I am a lawyer, but I think it's important to note that, and it's a great question. First of all, I think it's important for me to say from the outset that we as lawyers have to recognize our complicity, our huge complicity in these systems, right? I think there's this, there's a lot of attention to obviously to policing, and that's what the subject of this conversation has been, and for good reason, because obviously these are the people in the community that are actively, we can watch them and watch their lethality as they kill Black people. But I think we also have to think about the fact that that's just one piece of the criminal justice or injustice system that we have. And, you know, we need to think about very critically about the role of lawyers, the role of prosecutors. You know, it's one thing to note that about 3/5 of the state in this country have prosecutors that are all white. 3/5 of the state, there are about 95, I'd say, % of the elected prosecutors in this country are white, and 80% of them are white men. That's huge, right? That's it's an important reality to understand that prosecutors have an enormous amount of power in this system. And I think we far too long have let them escape scrutiny for their role in all of this. I think the police are a really visible target, right? And for good reason. We can look at them, we can see them operating on the streets. Prosecutors, judges, the sort of legal system escape scrutiny because it's just not visible in the same way. At the same time, police officers don't put people in jail, prosecutors do. Right? Prosecutors do. And we let that go. We sort of don't scrutinize that in the same way. And I think part of this movement to defund and to abolish policing has to also think about what the role of these legal professionals are. I also would say that we have to be really critical and a bit radical in thinking about law itself, right? I mean, policing is one thing, and I'm going to leave that aside, but we live in a society where we don't even question the nature of the law, right? We have some kind of notion of it as being this neutral object, right? That's sort of transcendent and eminent, and it just comes from somewhere. But, laws, of course, are made by people, and obviously by people who have power, people who very often do not look like me or many of you, people who with their biases and their prejudices and their racism, obviously make laws that benefit and a certain power structure and certain power hierarchies. I always think about the George Floyd episode was really interesting to me because, it started ostensibly around this issue of a counterfeit $20 bill. Right. And so, and Eric Garner, the selling of loose cigarettes, right? And these things are, they're laws that criminalize these things. And it's interesting as a society that we think these things are actions that need to be criminalized when, the people who are real, and these are economic crimes, of course, the people who are really committing economic crimes, of course, are on Wall Street, who are robbing American citizens of enormous billions of dollars. I thought it was interesting at the time that George Floyd happened that, American billionaires also made about $434 billion during the pandemic, while George Floyd is being killed for an allegedly fake $20 bill. I wrap up by saying that we have to think very critically about law, right? We have to think about policing, but we need to think about law. We need to be thinking about why we criminalize what we criminalize. We need to be thinking about the fact of how our legal system looks. The fact that 3/5 of the states have no prosecutors of color is shocking. And the fact that we really need to examine this sort of hidden part of the criminal justice system if we're really going to make this a lasting change. We can abolish police offices. But if we don't make fundamental changes to our legal system, we'll be back here again. There's no question about it. We'll be back. People will be prosecuted. They'll be caged again. It won't go away. So I think it's a crucial piece of this puzzle to really focus some of our attention on the legal system in its more in its less obvious aspects. Thank you, though. That was a great question.
Gabby, is it possible for us to keep going a little bit? Do people have to go?
Does everyone have time for maybe like 5 more minutes to go over? I don't want to keep everyone. I know that it's finals and it's madness, but just for a few more minutes? Okay, great.
I'm happy for this to keep going all day.
This could be a many months long seminar. I'm just looking at in order of the chat questions. Kevin had a question. He asks, how do we work to dismantle police systems while balancing concerns about white terrorism? We know that even during George Bush's tenure in office, the FBI found that white supremacists were recruiting within federal and local and state law enforcement offices. And there's been a lot of discussion in abolitionist communities about if the police were actually disbanded, would these same police officers then transfer into other parts of either white crime or white terrorism specifically? So if the panel could address that, that would be fantastic.
Maybe I could just jump on this quickly. So that will happen. And no one should be surprised or concerned or questioning about it. After the Nazis lost the war, some rogue Nazis went and did hate crimes against Jewish people. After slavery was abolished and the slave patrols were dissolved, those former slave patrollers and slave owners joined the Ku Klux Klan, right? So there is a history of white backlash, and I would recommend White Rage by Carol Anderson. It's a great book that talks about instances of Black sort of progression and white resistance. And she was one of my professors at Emory. But I think particularly here, two things. The first one is that, and I'm sorry if this is gonna pop anyone's bubble, but Dylan Roof, for example, the Charleston shooter who murdered those people in South Carolina, he had been on the FBI's white supremacist database and watch list for about 3 years. The reality of this moment is white supremacist terror organizations are known and have been identified to both local and federal enforcement agencies. They have no interest in rooting this out. If you want to, I guess, see a pop culture example, you can watch The Black Klansman, which is based on a true story of a Black man who is actually a member of the FBI who is actively working to dismantle the Klan, and the program was dismantled and stopped, and he was fired and released, and all of the files were destroyed from that. So the reality of this is police not only don't keep us safe from harm in our communities, they also don't keep us safe from planned harm, because they're not intended to. That's not their purpose. And so the reality of what I say to that may ruffle some feathers, but I believe that human beings have the right to live in peace, and that right to live in peace should be defended with one's life. And I feel the right to self-defense is a part of being made war upon. So the reality of when Black people were safest in America, it's never been under police protection, but it was when Black communities had large gun ownership and lived in concentrated communities where armed Black men went on patrols, read Black Panther Party for self-defense, went on armed patrols and protected those communities did experience less terroristic violence. Just quickly, I wanted to jump on Charles' point, though, about prosecutors. My master's thesis coming out of political science department at Emory University was called Do Black Prosecutors Matter? And it was all about trying to figure out if having more prosecutors of color would reduce racial disparities in the criminal justice system. I'd be happy to share that paper with you, Charles, but just as a spoiler alert, it does reduce the disparities significantly, but not completely, and points to larger structural issues, as you were mentioning, with the law and the way the system works.
Please do. I'd love to read that.
Great. I think we have to wrap up. I know I myself have to hop on another call at 3:15. I really apologize, but I just wanted to say once again, thank you so much to our panelists for coming, and thank you so much to everyone who came in attendance today. I think that we're really living through a historic moment, and it's just incredible to be able to find spaces for solidarity and conversation like this. And I just wanted to say thank you again and give a round of applause to our wonderful panelists. Thank you very, very much. And that we look forward to hosting similar events in the Somerville MCR and continuing on these conversations about social justice and critical work that can be done in this area. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Good luck with finals. Bye.